Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling agroecology, and we're going beyond the basics this time, really
Yeah,
trying to dig into those core concepts, the stuff that makes agroecology so fascinating and complex.
It's definitely a deep dive.
It is.
Yeah.
And we're going to be using a very specific source for this.
Okay.
It's called Seeds of Change,
Mm-hmm.
a comprehensive guide to agroecological transition. And we are going to be focusing specifically on Chapter 1, Understanding Agroecology in Depth.
Yeah.
Now, to help me unpack all of this, because it's a pretty dense chapter, I've got an expert here with me, someone who can help connect those dots between the science, the
Yeah.
practice, and really kind of the movement that agroecology embodies.
Well, I'm happy to be here. And yeah, it's a fascinating chapter. It kind of like right out of the gate, it challenges that notion that agroecology is just about, sustainable farming practices.
Right.
There's a lot more to it than that.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
So how does this chapter define agroecology?
Well, it talks about agroecology as having three interconnected dimensions. So there's the science, the practice, and the movement. And the science piece, focuses on applying ecological principles to agriculture. So like really understanding how ecosystems work, nutrient cycling, promoting biodiversity.
So it's about seeing the farm as an ecosystem, not just a factory for churning out food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. But then there's the practice dimension, which is where the rubber meets the road, and they give some fascinating examples of agroecological practices from around the world.
Oh, give me an example. Like what kind of practices are we talking about?
Well, they talk about this ancient technique called the Three Sisters method,
Good.
practiced in Latin America. And this is where farmers plant maize, beans, and squash together in this way that they support each other's growth.
Wait, so it's like they're creating these plant partnerships intentionally.
Yeah.
That's so cool. But is that kind of thing really practical for like feeding, an entire population?
That's a question that a lot of people have. And it's definitely something that we'll be exploring as we go deeper into this chapter. But what's important here is that the practice dimension isn't just about replicating these ancient techniques. It's about using them as inspiration,
Okay.
as a starting point, and then using modern scientific knowledge to kind of adapt and refine these practices for different contexts.
So it's like taking the best of both worlds, the wisdom of the past
Yeah,
and the tools of the present.
yeah,
Okay, I like that.
yeah.
But what about this movement aspect? That's the one that really throws me for a loop.
Yeah, it's not something you typically associate with agriculture, but, this chapter argues that agroecology is more than just a set of techniques or a scientific discipline. It's a social movement. It's a call for, a more just and sustainable food system.
Okay, interesting. So what does that actually look like? What are the goals of this movement?
Well, it talks about advocating for small-scale farmers, promoting local food systems, and challenging the power dynamics of the industrial food complex. It's about recognizing that our food choices have, profound social, economic, and environmental implications.
But isn't all that a bit idealistic? I mean, the industrial food system is huge. How can a grassroots movement like this really make a dent?
Yeah, and to be honest, the chapter doesn't shy away from those challenges.
Okay.
It acknowledges that transitioning to a more agroecological model is not going to be easy, but it does provide this really interesting historical perspective that I found quite encouraging, actually.
Okay, let's rewind a bit. What's the historical context for agroecology? Did this movement just pop up out of nowhere?
No, not at all. The chapter actually traces the roots of agroecological thought back centuries, even millennia. It talks about how many indigenous cultures around the world have been practicing agroecology for generations
Wow.
without even calling it that.
So they intuitively understood these principles of working with nature.
Yeah, it seems that way.
That's amazing. Give me an example.
Well, they talk about the milpa system in Mesoamerica,
Okay.
and it's this incredible intercropping system where maize, beans, and squash are grown together. And the maize provides support for the beans to climb the beans, fix nitrogen in the soil, benefiting the maize. And the squash acts as like a living mulch, suppressing weeds.
So it's like this perfectly choreographed dance between plants.
Exactly, yeah. And you see this not just in the Americas. The chapter gives examples from Africa, Asia, Europe.
Dang.
It's clear that these principles are deeply rooted in traditional farming practices around the world.
So if these ideas have been around for so long, why aren't they more widespread? What happened?
Well, the chapter highlights the rise of modern agricultural science and the Green Revolution. And
Yeah.
while the Green Revolution did have some benefits, like increasing crop yields, it also came with some serious drawbacks.
Like what?
Well, they talk about the heavy reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, the loss of biodiversity, degradation of soil health, and, the displacement of small-scale farmers.
Yeah.
It's like we traded short-term gains for long-term
It's
consequences.
just to wonder if those ancient cultures knew something that we've forgotten.
I think so. And, that's why the emergence of agroecology as a formal scientific discipline in the 1970s and 80s is so significant. It's like a rediscovering of these ancient principles, but now with the added power of modern science to back them up.
So it's not just about going back to the past. It's about using the past to inform a better future.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. But how does all of this connect to the idea of sustainability?
That's where things get really interesting. The chapter draws a direct line between agroecology and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
For those of us who are not fluent in UN jargon,
Yeah.
what exactly are the SDGs?
Well, think of them as like a global to-do list for a more sustainable future. They cover everything from ending hunger to protecting biodiversity to tackling climate change.
Oh, that's pretty ambitious.
It is.
And how does agroecology fit into all of that?
Well, the chapter argues that agroecology is uniquely positioned to contribute to achieving many of these goals. Let's take SDG 2. Zero hunger, for example.
Okay.
Agroecology promotes, these diverse, resilient food systems that are less reliant on chemical inputs and better adapted to local conditions. And this can help improve food security and nutrition, especially in vulnerable communities.
So it's not just about producing more food, it's about producing food that is healthier, more accessible, and more sustainable.
Exactly. And then there's SDG 13, climate action. Agroecology focuses on practices that build soil health and sequester carbon. And this can help mitigate climate change while also making farms more resilient to its impacts.
So it's like tackling climate change from both ends,
Yeah.
reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to a changing climate.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
It is. And these are just a couple examples, the chapter goes on to highlight how agroecology can contribute to achieving many other SDGs as well. It's like this holistic framework for addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing humanity.
Okay. I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
But if agroecology is so beneficial, why isn't it more widely practiced? What are the barriers to its adoption?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that we'll be exploring in depth as we continue our deep dive. This chapter is really just the tip of the iceberg. We've got a lot more ground to cover.
Well, I am on board for this journey.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's going to be fascinating to see where this deep dive takes us. I think the chapter kind of anticipates that question about why agroecology isn't more widespread. It goes on to compare agroecology with some other approaches to sustainable agriculture.
Okay.
And I think by looking at those comparisons, we can kind of get a better sense of, what makes agroecology unique and also maybe what some of those potential roadblocks might be.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's start with something familiar. What about organic farming? How does agroecology compare to that?
Yeah, well, both organic and agroecology share some common goals. They both aim to reduce environmental impact, promote biodiversity, and produce healthy food.
Right.
But there is kind of a subtle difference in their focus.
What's the difference?
Well, organic farming tends to focus more on what you don't use.
Oh.
It's about avoiding synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. It's very much rule-based.
Right, so there's like a clear set of standards that you have to meet in order to be certified organic.
Exactly. And those standards are important. But agroecology takes a broader perspective.
Okay.
It's not just about the inputs, it's about the whole system.
Right.
It's about designing and managing farms in a way that mimics natural ecosystems, that promotes resilience, that benefits both people and planet.
So it's less about following a rigid set of rules and more about adapting principles to different contexts.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that can make it a bit harder to define and, frankly, to market. You don't see an agroecology label on your food in the grocery store, do you?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the lack of a clear label or certification could be a barrier to wider adoption. People like to know what they're getting.
Yeah.
And those labels kind of provide that sense of trust.
Absolutely. And it also kind of ties into another key difference that the chapter highlights, the economic aspect.
Okay.
Organic farming is largely driven by consumer demand.
Mm-hmm.
People are willing to pay a premium for those organic products,
Right.
which creates a market incentive for farmers to adopt those practices.
But that also means that organic farming can be more accessible to larger farms that have the resources to meet those certifications.
Right.
Smaller farms and farmers in developing countries might face more challenges. I wonder if that plays into why agroecology hasn't taken off in the same way.
Yeah, that's a crucial question about equity and access,
Right.
which, as we've discussed, is a core concern of the agroecological movement. Now, the chapter also compares agroecology to regenerative agriculture, and
Okay.
that's where things get even more nuanced.
Well, regenerative agriculture, that's another one I hear a lot about these days. What's the connection there?
Well, both approaches share a strong emphasis on soil health.
Okay.
Regenerative agriculture is all about building soil organic matter, improving water infiltration, sequestering carbon.
That sounds pretty agroecological to me.
It does, and there's definitely a lot of overlap. But some argue that regenerative agriculture, while fantastic for the environment, can sometimes overlook those social and economic dimensions that are so central to agroecology.
So you could have a farm that's technically regenerative in terms of its soil health, but maybe not so great for the people working on it or for the local community.
Exactly. That's the critique that some people make. They say, it's possible to focus so much on the ecological aspects that you neglect the human element.
That's a really important point. It's like we need to remember that sustainability isn't just about the environment. It's about creating a system that works for everyone.
Right. And that brings us to the final comparison in the chapter, permaculture.
Okay. Now that one's always seemed a bit mysterious to me.
Yeah.
What's the deal with permaculture? Is it even agriculture?
It's a great question. And, the chapter acknowledges that permaculture can be a bit of a slippery concept.
Right.
It's more than just agriculture. It's about designing sustainable human settlements. Think,
Hmm.
Food forests, edible landscaping, integrated systems that provide for multiple needs, not just food, but also fuel, fiber, and shelter.
So it's like taking those agroecological principles and applying them to our whole way of life.
Exactly. It's about creating a way of life that is in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
And because permaculture is so focused on design, it can offer some really valuable insights for agroecological systems.
But it goes beyond just farming, right? It's more about creating those self-sufficient closed-loop systems that can regenerate resources and support communities over the long term.
That's the idea. And that's where it overlaps with agroecology. Both approaches emphasize minimizing waste-building resilience, working with nature rather than against it.
This is all starting to make sense. So even though there are these other approaches to sustainable agriculture, agroecology stands out because of its focus on those three interconnected dimensions: the
Yeah.
science, the practice, and that social movement.
Exactly. It's that holistic approach that makes it so powerful. But as you pointed out earlier, there are still some significant barriers to wider adoption.
So let's talk about those barriers. If agroecology is so great, why isn't everyone doing it?
Well, as we've kind of touched on, there are some practical challenges, like the lack of clear certification market incentives.
Right.
But the chapter digs deeper into some of those more systemic issues that are often at play.
Okay, I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty. So let's get into those systemic issues. What are we up against here?
Well, the chapter paints a pretty stark picture of the dominant model of agriculture today, what we often call industrial agriculture. And it's a system that prioritizes efficiency and profit above all else.
Okay, so remind me, what are the key characteristics of industrial agriculture?
Well, think, vast monocultures, heavy reliance on chemical inputs, intensive animal farming, and a globalized food system that transports food thousands of miles from where it's grown to where it's consumed.
Right, it's like we've created this incredibly efficient machine for producing food,
Mm.
but maybe we forgot to consider the long-term consequences.
Exactly. And the chapter points out that, this industrial model has led to a whole host of problems: soil degradation, biodiversity loss,
Yeah.
water pollution, climate change, not to mention the social and economic impacts on farmers and rural communities.
So it's like this vicious cycle where we're trying to solve one problem, feeding a growing population, but we're creating a whole bunch of new problems in the process.
That's a great way to put it. And the chapter argues that agroecology offers a way to break out of that cycle. It's about shifting from a system that extracts and exploits to one that regenerates and nourishes.
Okay, I'm all for that. But it sounds like a pretty daunting task.
Yeah.
How do we actually make that shift? Where do we even begin?
Well, the chapter acknowledges that transitioning to agroecology isn't a quick fix. It's a process, it's a journey, and it requires a fundamental shift in mindset,
Okay.
both for farmers and for consumers.
So it's not just about changing practices, it's about changing the way we think about food and agriculture altogether.
Precisely. And that means challenging some deeply ingrained assumptions, like the idea that we need to produce more food to feed the world.
Wait, but isn't that true? The global population is growing, so we need more food, right?
But that's the narrative we've been told, but the chapter suggests that it's not the whole story. It points out that we already produce enough food to feed everyone on the planet.
Really? So what's the problem then?
The problem is distribution waste and overconsumption. A significant portion of the food that we produce is waste lost in transit or ends up in landfills. And in many parts of the world, people are consuming far more calories than they need, which leads to, health problems like obesity and
So
diabetes.
maybe the solution isn't producing more food, but rather using the food we already have more efficiently and equitably.
Exactly. And agroecology emphasizes local food systems, reducing food waste and shifting towards more plant-based diets. It's about creating a food system that's not just productive, but also just and sustainable.
I love that. But even if we can shift our mindset, how do we actually make this transition happen on the ground? What needs to change in terms of policy and infrastructure?
Well, that's where the movement aspect of agroecology comes into play. The chapter stresses the need for collective action, for farmers, researchers, policymakers, and consumers to work together to create a more supportive environment for agroecology to flourish.
So it's not just about individual farmers making changes on their own. It's about creating a system that supports those changes.
Exactly. And that means advocating for policies that support small-scale farmers, that promote research and education in agroecology, and that incentivize sustainable practices.
Right, because right now those incentives are often skewed towards the industrial model.
Exactly. So part of the challenge is shifting those incentives, changing the rules of the game to level the playing field for agroecology.
This is all starting to click. But if agroecology is so great for people and the planet, why is there so much resistance to it? Who benefits from keeping the current system in place?
That's a question worth exploring further. And the chapter hints at the power dynamics at play here. The large corporations that control much of the global food system, the vested interests in maintaining the status quo.
It's like those who benefit from the current system have a lot to lose if we shift to a more agroecological model.
Exactly. But the chapter also emphasizes that this isn't just a battle between good and evil. There are complex economic and social factors at play, and it's important to understand those nuances in order to find solutions that work for everyone.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've gone from the basics of agroecology to exploring its historical roots, comparing it to other approaches, and even delving into those systemic challenges we face. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of what agroecology is all about, but I also have so many more questions.
Me too. And that's the beauty of it. Agroecology is a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly learning, adapting, and working together to create a more just and sustainable food system.
Well, on that inspiring note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating journey.
It's been a pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to, keep exploring agroecology, learn more about the farms in your community, support your local food systems, and get involved in the movement for change. There's so much we can do to create a better food future for everyone.
Until next time.